This podcast comes to you from the University of Toronto, Mississauga. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the university operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We are grateful to work on this land, and we strive toward peace and reconciliation among all peoples. Hi, I'm Jill Caskey, Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Welcome to Medieval Art Matters, a podcast where we showcase the vitality of contemporary research on the Middle Ages. In each episode, we invite a scholar to talk about a critical issue that shaped the experiences of people living centuries ago and that still matters today. I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Erika Loic, for a discussion of today's theme, race.
Hi, I'm Erika Loic, Assistant Professor of Global Medieval Art at Florida State University. Today we'll be speaking to Dr. Mary Rambaran-Olm, a literary historian specializing in the early medieval period in England. Her current research focuses on race and racism within the field of early English studies. She is completing her second book for the Cambridge Elements series, titled Race in Early Medieval England, co-edited with Eric Wade. She is an activist and public intellectual, and some of her writings have appeared in publications including Time, Public Books, Archaeology Today, and Smithsonian. She is currently a Provost Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Toronto.
Welcome, Dr. Rambaran-Olm, and thank you so much for being on our show.
Thanks for having me.
We're looking at an image on the podcast section of our website, artofthemiddleages.com, of an abbot, a leader of a monastery. Could you please give us a basic sense of the work, who's depicted, who made it, and why?
This is Abbot Hadrian, also known as Adrian. He's a 7th century abbot born in Liberia Inferior. We don't know for sure which modern country he is from, so possibly Egypt or Northern Sudan. He ended up traveling from the south up to England in the 7th century. He was offered the position of archbishop and he turned that down. He sort of made a deal with the Pope of the time and said, look, I don't want this job, but I have the right man for you. His name is Theodore. He's a good friend. And so he traveled with Theodore and ended up staying with him for the rest of his life in England. And so there they established a large religious community, and the intellectual community was thriving partly because of them. So the image that you have was commissioned by a young student. They actually draw images throughout history and sort of incorporate images into today's sorts of scenarios. So this artist wanted to gift me something that they felt was important in terms of the work that I was doing, but also just to sort of push back at people who are adverse to seeing images of Black figures in early England. The artist's name is Nicholas El-Kazan Mendiola.
So when this student artist made the image, were they drawing inspiration from specific medieval texts or other images? What did they bring to existing information on this figure?
They've done some of the research on their own, but just looking at existing images of Hadrian, obviously there wouldn't have been many from the period. So the contemporary sort of images are of a dark-skinned figure. So the artist was just sort of drawing on that and then filling in the gaps. But the main point that they were getting across was that England wasn't all white, even at the time. And that's something that we often don't think about.
Yeah, the painting makes it really clear that Hadrian was a person of color. And yet our stereotype of church leaders in early medieval England and Europe, usually the stereotype sees them as white. What are some of the steps that you've taken to find people of color in the distant past and to recover their presence and recover their voices?
It's actually easier to find these figures in history that are people of color because church history is, especially in Europe, was founded in Rome. But with the Roman Empire, there were people from everywhere. And so in England, when they were establishing their church, they had to bring people from somewhere. So a lot of these people were coming from Africa. They were being called up north. And it's not necessarily my view as a person of color, but I know that the white gaze is something that Franz Fanon talks about. It's just something that's sort of in our psyche, that it's very common, or the default is to see everything and everyone as white. If we think back to that period and these bishops and abbots and monks and whoever who were coming from abroad, they were coming from Africa, and Africa was as diverse as it is now. And the fact that Hadrian's early depictions are that he was dark-skinned, that's something that has sort of been sidestepped and whitewashed as well, that's not discussed. And we don't necessarily want to just draw attention to that as that was all he was, this black man or this person of color, but it is a very important part of who he was. And that is the same with church history, that you can see that in the manuscripts and even in the marginalia. Like I'm doing a thread this month for Black History Month on Black figures in the pre-modern world. And there's so many little glimpses we see of dark-skinned or Black people in marginalia that either we're not used to it or we just ignore it. Looking at the literature, looking at the images, we do see the diversity that was there that we've just decided or chosen to ignore for centuries.
This idea of the white gaze, I came across a sentence recently that really resonated with me in the work of Cord Whitaker. And he writes, "Race is what the rest of the world has." I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what medieval people think about race. We have certain ideas of what we think about race, but for the medieval viewer, is it something external, something physical? Is it something to do with lineage, genetics, or is it practice and ritual based?
You've sort of touched on everything. One of the problems that we do have, or one of the criticisms that we have, is that we're imposing even certain terms on people who didn't have an understanding or had a different understanding of race. And so they say this is anachronistic. But we impose a lot of anachronistic things on the Middle Ages and the past, and we just pick and choose what we are upset about. Professor Geraldine Heng has done some work on mostly the later Middle Ages and has touched on pretty much everything that you've said, that it included religion. And she doesn't really touch on hues, although that did sort of start to play into what different races were. But in the early period, in the early Middle Ages, it was very much a part of kinship, who was in your family, who you saw as part of your clan. Religion was part of that as well. There was anti-Semitism way back in England by the time of the Crusades. But something else that we don't talk about very much in terms of race is anti-Blackness. So that's something that in the work that Dr. Wade and I are doing, that we're sort of bringing to the forefront. And that's something that is probably not discussed as much in Dr. Heng's book and research. But hue was important as well. And there was a level of anti-Blackness in the Middle Ages as well. And it wasn't just tied to spiritual things like cleanliness and darkness. That was all rooted in anti-Blackness. But there was certainly a level of anti-Blackness that you see and read about in the literature of the time in early England.
So it's clear that a lot of your research, in addition to inspiring your students, is challenging paradigms or conventional ways of looking at the Middle Ages. And I wonder if you could maybe talk a bit more about what's at stake when you challenge these conventional views.
Well, yeah. When we're talking about what's at stake, the truth is at stake. We have been talking about in the past few years, especially about truthiness and what is true and facts. So looking at the past, the way that we're trying to now, it's correcting false narratives or whitewashed narratives. And a lot of these are rooted in colonialism. There is the criticism and the backlash that, well, you're rewriting history and you're recreating and making things up. Actually, no, we're actually just reading the evidence that's there and that hasn't been read before, or it's been erased or ignored. So it's not us creating or recreating anything that wasn't or isn't available to us. In terms of what's at stake, we're already into this phase where white supremacists are using images and stories of the past to create false narratives to support hate. So there is a lot at risk in terms of safety as well. A lot of us doing this work, our lives are at risk sometimes. It's important to continue to push back. But, I'm guilty of using the sort of whitewashed narratives in the past as well. But we grow as scholars, we grow as people. And so it's our job to correct those things. Our field won't survive. Our field just won't survive if we don't not just correct the past or correct the false narratives, but bring these stories into the present, as you guys are doing as well. It's important that people see that we're still connected and that these stories, if we don't learn about them, we're sort of doomed to relive these horrible mistakes of the past.
I was going to say something similar in terms of the vitality of the field, because you brought up this idea of false narratives. We have false narratives that people have applied to the past, but we also have false narratives that people internalize about who should and shouldn't be studying the Middle Ages, who is allowed into art history, who is allowed into the study of the Middle Ages. So what kind of advice would you have for young people coming into the field who maybe don't see themselves represented? And that doesn't even have to be just with race.
There's so much intersectionality as well that when we're talking about people who are sidelined, the voices who have always sort of either climbed or floated to the top of the pyramid are usually the straight white men. And then under that is you might have straight white women as well now who are making their way to the top and they're pulling up the ladder behind them. Art history, I think, is sort of dealing with how to make things more inclusive for people who are marginalized, who are from marginalized communities. I think that the work needs to be done with those who are in the field right now to make changes and make those sustainable changes so that the marginalized people who want to come in now or want to come in later on, they're not bearing the brunt of the work. Because it's one thing to just be a body in the field and be, represented just, well, you look, I'm, a half black, half brown woman. And yeah, I'm in the field, but what am I doing in the field apart from getting backlash like every day? So it's part of our job, I think, to do that work and establish the field that people can come and have a seat at the table because they want a seat, not because they have to make room for themselves. Or be invited as well, that the room is just there for them. I think just having diversity isn't going to fix the problems that are in the field. We have problems of racism and homophobia and transphobia and bigotry and sexism and all of those things, predators and whatever else. So we need to really do the groundwork for these upcoming scholars, whatever that takes.
It's a collective effort in a way to alter the institutional structures that we have so that they don't replicate what they've had for generations, where in our field, at least typically a few generations ago, there were certain expectations about what it took to succeed in this field. And that has to change and all of us have to help.
Mm-hmm. And I think, as you said, it has to do with people who are already in the field having the courage to call out these issues, even if it doesn't serve them, or even if they don't perceive it as having some benefit to them, because it can't, as you say, fall always on the shoulders of 10 people to educate everybody else.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask another forward-looking question. Where do you see your field going, and where would you like it to go?
Well, it depends on what sort of mood I'm in, because some days I just wanted to die. But my hope for the field is that enough people will want to see it survive, not just until they retire, but in the long term for the next generation, the next generation, the next generation. And that the more people who like Erika said, the more people who basically see that something might not benefit them, but it's worth fighting for and saving, that will breathe new life into the field so that it has a chance to survive. With the humanities just struggling across the board, we need to make a case for ourselves. I would like to see that happen, that this movement actually grows and that people just take seriously that we're relevant today, we'll be relevant tomorrow as well. And that it's an important field to study and appreciate and that it's worth it. So my hope is that this field, that the people within it will wake up before it's too late and that we won't lose the voices that are necessary right now, who are important in the long-term survival of the field.
Thank you so much for coming to speak to us. And thank you also for the work that you do. It's obviously having a reach, inspiring students, and even beautiful artworks.
Well, thanks for having me, you guys.
That was Dr. Mary Rambaran-Olm speaking to us about race and diversity in the Middle Ages. You've been listening to an episode of Medieval Art Matters, hosted by Erika Loic and me, Jill Caskey. Medieval Art Matters complements a book written by Jill Caskey, Adam Cohen, and Linda Safran, called Art and Architecture of the Middle Ages, Exploring a Connected World. It is published by Cornell University Press. For more information, go to the website that accompanies the book, artofthemiddleages.com, where you'll also find more podcasts in this series.
Medieval Art Matters is made possible by the support of the Department of Art History at the University of Toronto St. George Campus and the Office of the Vice Principal and Dean, University of Toronto, Mississauga. Many thanks to the Toronto Consort for providing the music.
This podcast was brought to you by Cited Media Productions. Thanks for listening.
You have been listening to a Cited Media production. CIDED. Find out more at citedmedia.ca.